Hi everyone, good evening. It's Renee, Vision Australia's campaigns advisor. Thank you so much for joining our advocacy influencing government webinar. I can see people joining very quickly as I speak, and it's so lovely to have your company tonight. Before we start tonight's webinar, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the people on the nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. We had a lot of registrations tonight, and for good reason. It's a very important topic around how we would go about advocating and influencing government change. And we've got two very experienced panelists tonight who's going to step through some of the fundamentals in how you might consider doing that. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the fundamental principles of individual and systemic advocacy, learning some of the steps and channels that you might want to consider when you go about making change for yourself as well as others. We'll talk about how you would consider getting cut through in a very saturated advocacy market when there's so many competing priorities going on. And we'll also discuss the importance of nurturing relationships. Now, before I introduce our panelists tonight, I just wanted to let you know that if this is an interactive webinar, so if you have any questions regarding the session, please send them through to campaigns@visionaustralia.org. That email address again, campaigns@visionaustralia.org. Please also send your questions through to the chat function, which might be located at the bottom of your screen, depending on the device that you're using tonight. A recording of the webinar will also be sent out to all registrations, and as well as our Stand Up for Your Rights guides, which provides a lot more information. I'm so excited to introduce and welcome our experienced panelists tonight. We've got Jess, our Government Relations Advisor, and Bruce Maguire, our Lead Policy Advisor. Jess.
Thanks, Renee. Hi, everyone. Great to be here tonight. So, as Renee said, my name is Jess. I've actually only been with Vision Australia for, I think, about 6 weeks now. Prior to that, I was working in another not-for-profit organisation, being the Stroke Foundation, and before that, I worked for a federal politician, Nick Xenophon.
Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Renee, and hi, everyone. It's Bruce Maguire here. I'm Lead Policy Advisor with Vision Australia. I've actually been at Vision Australia for almost 12 years, but as I'm totally blind, I've had a lifetime of involvement with the blindness sort of sector and with the organisations that operate in the blindness sector, including Vision Australia and all of its predecessor organisations. Although I've been at Vision Australia for 12 years, this is the first time I've participated in a webinar, so it's really good to be able to be part of the broader group and hopefully answer some of your questions.
And it's wonderful to finally have you involved in our webinars, Bruce. We've got so much to get through tonight in our 1-hour session, so we'll get straight into it. And firstly, we're going to talk about individual and systemic advocacy, and specifically looking closer at these terms. Bruce, I was wondering, can you tell us more about the difference between individual and systemic issues, as well as when they might have crossover?
Thanks, Randy. Yes, well, I like to think of advocacy as a spectrum, and with individual sort of at one end and systemic at the other end. I suppose it's more the spectrum is more shaped like a circle than a line, because there are definitely cases that you would describe as individual advocacy. There are other things that you would certainly say are systemic advocacy, and then as you mentioned, Renee, there are things where there's a crossover. So an individual advocacy matter is one where an individual has an issue that they need a resolution of reasonably quickly in general. So to give an example of that, I might have an issue with my NDIS plan that I need a resolution of relatively quickly. So that's an individual advocacy matter. A systemic advocacy matter is generally an issue that affects a whole group of people, a whole community, all people who are blind or have low vision, or certain sort of defined groups. And an example might be the campaign that Vision Australia and other organisations have been involved with for quite a long time now, to get audio description on television. But then you have cases that start off as individual but do have systemic implications. So an example would be, as an individual, you might be required to complete a Centrelink form, and you find that the Centrelink form is not accessible, so you can't actually complete it. So you contact Centrelink and ask for a copy of the form in an accessible format, and they don't have one. So then it becomes a systemic issue, and the advocacy shifts to encouraging Centrelink to make all of its forms available in accessible formats for anyone who wants them. So there is that definite kind of interplay between systemic and individual advocacy.
Yeah, and I think we've also learnt with individual advocacy that it can be, or systemic, it can be quite complex and very, very specific a response we required. We had a question come through, Bruce, during the registration period, and Jess and Bruce, you might both be able to comment on this, and that's, where are places we can seek legal advice when an issue of discrimination requires greater action than just advocacy?
I'll start with that one, Renee, and then Jess, feel free to add. It's actually quite it's a simple question, but it actually has quite a complex answer, because sources of legal advice sort of depend a lot on where you live and the type of issue it is. Lawyers specialise in the same way that doctors and other professionals do. So there's no guarantee that the same lawyer who might assist you with a disability discrimination matter is also the lawyer that's assisting you with your company tax or issues around your neighbours, disputes and things like that. So it's important to get the right people to give you the right legal advice, because it's such a complex area, and it does depend a lot on individual sort of circumstances and what the issue is, whether it's about state legislation or Commonwealth legislation, for example. My advice to anyone who has this question is to contact our advocacy team, so they can talk through the specific issue that you're dealing with and advise you accordingly.
And if anyone that's listening is seeking advice, particularly around a specific matter, like Bruce mentioned, you can contact Vision Australia on 1300 884 74 66. And just to extend on what you said, Bruce, it is very true. It's very complex when it comes down to an individual matter indeed. And we will be sending out our very, very comprehensive Stand Up for Your Rights guides, which is a fantastic place to get lots of different contacts that we've already done the hard work by finding out a lot of contacts in your key states and regions that you may consider wanting to contact, as well as their purpose or their function in that process.
And those Stand Up for Your Rights guides are also good because they give you a range of options apart from legal advice. So you don't necessarily have to rush in and seek sort of formal legal advice. There are all sorts of other less formal ways you can try to resolve issues, and they're all explained in the Stand Up for Your Rights guides.
That's right. That's a very good point. If you're just joining us tonight, welcome to our Influencing Government Advocacy webinar. It's an interactive session, so please send through your questions to campaigns@visionaustralia.org, or send it through via the chat function that will be located in the webinar down the bottom. And if you've just joined us, we've just been speaking around the differences between individual and systemic, and the complexities around that. They might be very, very separated and different, but they can also have a crossover when you apply the notion that if it's affecting other people, then there's chances are that it would be a systemic issue, and to seek legal advice via Vision Australia. We're going to move on now to the next section, and where we'll be discussing more around campaigning for change. And in this area, we'll discuss the role of members of parliament as well as engaging government. And one thing that comes to mind in this particular area, Bruce, is around, there are instances when you would want to engage with various, levels of government depending on the issue. But specifically, Bruce, can you tell us about your experiences of the value of engaging members of parliament? Why is that so effective?
Thanks, Rennie. When I always draw strength from a quote from the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And that quote sort of illustrates that change can happen from the bottom up, not just from the top down. So we as individuals can be powerful agents for change. And I think a very effective way of becoming a powerful change agent at the bottom or individual level is to connect with our local MPs, because local MPs, both state and federal, are there primarily to serve their constituents. It might not be obvious all the time that that's what they're there for, but that is indeed a core function of MPs. And my experience in liaising or connecting with my MPs is that they are genuinely interested in the issues that I have. I've talked to my local MPs on a couple of occasions. One was many years ago when I was just starting a small business and I wanted to try and get some funding to get some assistive technology that I needed to run it. And the second time was more recently when I was having an issue with trying to get a decision from the NDIA about, again, assistive technology in my NDIS plan. And both times I found the MPs very, very approachable and very, very interested in what I was saying. So I think it's building those relationships with MPs is really valuable.
Absolutely. We've just got a question that's come through from our pre-registrations that I think was a good time to ask, because it does extend into engaging government. And this one specifically around the issue around unemployment in the blindness and low vision community is quite high, and how we can go about improving it. And I do wonder, Bruce, with this particular question, because we had another one that was looking at how do we go about improving enforcing web accessibility guidelines. And I guess I can see that natural relationship between increasing employment and web accessibility guidelines.
Yes.
Talk a bit more around those questions.
Yes, thanks, Reedy. I'm very happy to talk about that because it's an important area, and unemployment in the disability sector generally has been one of the biggest systemic challenges that we've had over the past 30, 40 years. And despite much advocacy and despite numerous sort of government inquiries and recommendations and promises, there has been very little change in the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate for people who are blind or have low vision is even higher than it is in the rest of the disability sector. The latest research suggests that internationally the unemployment rate for people who are blind or have low vision is well over 50%. And one of the barriers, for us as people who are blind or have low vision is that as technology has developed and we have become an increasingly technology-driven society, there hasn't always, or perhaps even often, been a corresponding development in accessibility. And so much of the mainstream technology, information and communications technology, as we call it, ICT technology that's used in mainstream workplaces, including government workplaces, and ICT includes things like printers, photocopiers, telephone switchboard systems, computer software, anything that you would use in a work environment. Much of that technology is becoming less accessible, or certainly has become less accessible, with things like touch screens and visual displays and visual menus and all of those things. Now, Rena, you mentioned the web accessibility. Where this is really important is that over the past 20 years, there has been the development of international standards for web accessibility called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which we affectionately know as WCAG, and we're now up to version 2.1 of those guidelines, and those guidelines set benchmarks for accessibility of websites and technologies that draw on the same kinds of technologies that are used in the web. And much software these days uses sort of web-style interfaces. And around the world, these standards have been adopted by various governments, including Australia. At the same time, we've also seen the development of what are known as accessible ICT procurement standards. Basically, what these standards say is that government bodies and departments and other sort of government-related entities have to purchase goods and services that are accessible if those goods and services are available in the marketplace. So in America, we've had for quite a number of years what are known as Section 508 guidelines, and it's Section 508 guidelines which require that US government departments buy accessible products and services that has really given us things like accessible iPhones with VoiceOver and Zoom. They've been a big driver of making mainstream ICT, information and communications technology products, more accessible. Now, Australia has recently adopted the European ICT procurement standard, and over time, we're hopeful that as governments around Australia, both state and Commonwealth, adopt these standards and make them part of their corporate culture, then the technology will become more accessible, and hence some of the barriers that we have faced in getting employment, particularly in a government environment, will be eliminated. But it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It requires quite a lot of advocacy. We have been doing quite a lot of advocacy over the past few years around this, and we'll continue to do that, and we'll no doubt call on people from time to time to assist us in, as we have campaigns around ICT procurement and unemployment.
That's a very, very good point to actually make around the fact that behind the scenes, Vision Australia is doing a lot around ICT procurement, and as you've explained in a beautifully rich response, that it is very complex, requiring a lot of support. And if you are interested to be informed about our advocacy campaigns that rely on constituent support, please email us at campaigns@visionaustralia.org and we'll add you to our mailing list. We've got a question now from Sarah, and Jess, this might be something that you could respond to. Thank you, Sarah. It's a really great one. It says, would it be fair to say that MPs are more likely to become involved in a matter if you've already attempted to address an issue directly with the organisation without success?
That is a really good question, and I think that is correct. I think in the first instance, if you're having an issue with anything, be it Centrelink, NDIS, an issue with a bank, really an issue with any government body or private organisation, it's always best to try and resolve it with them first. Once you go to your MP's office, they will probably ask you what steps you've taken to address it yourself, and then they can then go to the organisation, as I said, be it NDIS or a bank or whatever, and say, look, we've got this constituent who's contacted us about the time it's taking for their plan to be reviewed. They've said that they've contacted you 3 times about this and haven't heard anything back. Can you please let us know what's going on? And then that's from that, you'll use, from my experience working in a politician's office, you'll get quite a quick response. So I think definitely try and address it first yourself, and if you're having no luck, then you can take that next step.
That's great. And it's and if sometimes it can take even for the most confident person to understand those steps and those tools, or writing a letter to a particular organisation or a manager perhaps can be tricky. And that's why our guides actually does have those steps and those templates, so that, like you just reinforced, Jess, you can actually go, right, I can take this template, I can use this language.
Absolutely. And that's something, again, you could call Vision Australia about for help with advocacy in addressing the issue first with the organisation. And then, if there was no luck there, then that's when you could move on, I think. Yeah.
Now, just, when you do consider directly, when would you consider directly engage with varying levels of government? And I'll mention that I know that you're quite new to Vision Australia, and you've had a chance to look at, I guess, the work the organisation's done around pushing for a minimum sound requirement on hybrid vehicles and getting some very strong and positive feedback from government. Could you tell us a little bit more around, I guess, what were the successes in that campaign, why it stood out?
Yeah, sure. Regarding the Silent Cars campaign, I think it was a really great example of a coordinated approach. So it sort of had a lot of different elements to it that kind of brought it together. For people listening who might not know what we're talking about, Vision Australia was advocating to the government to have an acoustic vehicle alerting system fitted to hybrid and electric vehicles. This was to bring Australia in line with both the US and the EU, who have mandated similar requirements. Basically, the organisation liaised and approached the Transport Minister as well as the Opposition Minister, various other politicians who would have a vested interest, such as Parliamentary Friends Group for Road Safety. As well as that, they really networked with a group of broader stakeholders, including researchers at Monash University, who were regularly engaging with government and had strong built relationships, and sort of, I guess, springboarded themselves off that. It was, as well, it involved engaging with media, social media, and sort of just bringing it all together, where now this issue around silent cars wasn't on the government's radar 12 months ago, and now it's something that they have committed to looking further into and actually hopefully doing something about.
That like reflecting on that particular campaign and what you and Bruce have been mentioning around when you are campaigning for change, being able to articulate what the issue is, the steps that you've taken if it's an individual matter. And what I'm hearing tonight, that if it is an issue that's more systemic, it's finding those politicians at various levels that have a responsibility or a vested interest, whether it's the Transport Council, whether it's the friendship groups around transport safety. In that one, it sounds like it takes just that research and being able to put your case forward.
Exactly, Rennie. And I think just on top of that, another element that really helps with these kind of campaigns is community-based advocacy. So often politicians will know what an organisation thinks about something. However, what they might not know is how important that issue is amongst their own electorate and the people who vote for them. So if you're working in a political office, if you're to receive 8 pieces of correspondence regarding the same issue, that's when you might take note and go, oh, okay, this is something that our our voters, our constituents really care about, let's look further into this. And I think that can be a really powerful tool.
And when you were working at the Stroke Foundation and were leading some of the advocacy campaigns there, and you've touched on now some of the broader stakeholders that are really important when you are looking to campaign for change outside of the political space.
Mm-hmm.
You know, who are they, and how do you reach them? And could you give us an example when you were working at the Stroke Foundation?
Yeah, sure. So I think mainly it is other organisations that have a vested interest in the issue as well as other people within the community that might be experiencing the same issue as you. I think social media is an excellent tool to engage both with organisations and with other like-minded individuals on an issue, and particularly when we're talking about social media is around video. So I know video might not be something that is for everyone. Definitely it's something that I can find a bit intimidating, but it can be a really excellent tool for spreading a message. So I'll just to talk about an example from when I was working at the Stroke Foundation, we ran a campaign around people needing to know the fast signs of stroke so that you can tell when someone is having a stroke and to be able to get them quick treatment. And part of this is that we did videos with stroke survivors who would state why the fast message saved their life, and how if someone hadn't known the fast message who was around them, their outcome could have been very different. The videos that we made and helped these stroke survivors make were shared by politicians all around the country, both on their social media channels and amongst their constituency. So it ended up getting a funding commitment for a national fast education campaign to teach people how to recognise a stroke. So I think the voice of the community showing their politicians why this was important and really putting a face to the issue was really what made it successful in the end.
So when you were talking around if someone was to look at doing video engagement, it sounded like quite a successful tactic in this, and dare I say in a lot of advocacy campaigns actually. What are some of the core things to include in that? How long should they be? What kind of principles did you follow at Stroke Foundation?
Absolutely. I think often it's good to keep them short, concise and to the point, and to sort of draw on emotion, to draw on the emotion of the issue, because at the end of the day, I think it's easy to forget that politicians are actually human beings as well, and hopefully they've got a little bit of emotion in there. So if you can really pull on that, tell your story and why this matters to you, I think that's the most important thing.
And being able to extend that reach, like you were mentioning, to find more like-minded people to share that same message through their own personal experience is really, really important. And Bruce, what are some of the, I guess, channels or ways that you could describe the role of networking in the blindness and low vision community, the importance of that in the role of advocacy?
Thanks, Renee. Well, networking is incredibly important. It's important for a number of reasons. One is that by networking, you can discover whether the issue that you're having is something that other people are having too. So, for example, if you're trying to do your grocery shopping online and you find that you can't find the submit button, or you can't add items to the cart or something like that, then networking with other people who are blind or have low vision will allow you to find out whether other people are also having that same problem. And if they're not, then you can explore in more detail why you are and they're not. But if they are, then you can be sort of fairly confident that the issue that you've encountered is an accessibility issue that needs to be addressed by the web developer. Networking, I think, is also important because it helps to build sort of coalitions. It helps to kind of share experiences and also get support. I mean, campaigning and bringing about change can be very draining. You can kind of really sort of sap your energy, particularly if there's lots of barriers that you face, and many of us do face lots of barriers because of the way society is. So having those networks of support networks can be really important and really encouraging. And there are sort of quite a lot of ways, that people can network. I think social media is increasingly important, and it's sometimes the social media channels aren't always as accessible as we'd like them to be, but nevertheless they are usable, and so they're a very valuable way. But there are also various sort of email discussion lists that are specifically for people who are blind, have low vision. Things like BCA's email list, and also vision impaired persons in Australasia email list. And again, if you don't know about those lists already and would like to know about them, please contact our advocacy team, and they can give you all of the details.
Thank you, Bruce and Jess. Now we have a question from Julie. Thanks, Julie. It's a good one. It says, Julie's asked, how useful are the commissioners to bring awareness to government about issues? For example, the Disability Discrimination Commissioner, Dr. Gauntlet.
Look, I think I think commissioners are important. They're important, particularly in raising issues of a more systemic nature. My experience certainly has been, and before I worked at Vision Australia, I did in fact work in the Australian Human Rights Commission for 9 years. So I had quite a lot of sort of contact with the Disability Discrimination Commissioner, and my experience is that the commissioners are not likely to get as involved with individual matters, but if there are issues of systemic nature, for example, unemployment, ICT procurement, I know that the Commission, the Human Rights Commission, has been sort of at the forefront of the campaign for ICT procurement for a long time, and the same goes for web accessibility and education. So I think that and we sort of maintain sort of connections with particularly the Disability Discrimination Commissioner. So I think it's just another, it is another important way for government to be kept aware of systemic issues that affect different groups.
And sometimes, Julie, in our experience, like Bruce was saying, it's like, and what Jess was saying, it's around applying pressure from all those multiple angles, especially when you know that the minister will say who's ultimately responsible might not be giving you the response that you're finding. In our experience, just to add on what Bruce was saying, being able to get the credibility or the endorsement of the commissioners and other allies from a political point can really help apply indirect pressure on your particular cause. We've got a question through from Sarah that might be of interest to the broader group, and that was just around to know if we had a dedicated, I guess, an advocacy alert newsletter. Sarah, I can see that we've responded to you, but I will extend that to the broader listeners out there. We share our news via our client newsletters, such as FYI and social media, rather than a dedicated newsletter. So stay in touch via our Facebook and Instagram, and you can contact our advocacy team and even us tonight if you have a question by emailing campaigns@visionaustralia.org. We're going to now move across to the next topic, and that's around how to get cut through in quite a saturated advocacy environment. And to broaden that thinking, it's around the fact that we know that there are a lot of competing and noble causes in the community, vying for consumer attention as well as political attention, like animal welfare and whatnot. Jess, you've worked for Nick Xenophon, and so you have a really good idea around what gets the attention of a member of parliament. Can you describe that how would you go about getting their attention? What is those kind of core things to remember if you are engaging?
Yeah, thanks, Rainey. So I think, firstly, it is really important to remember that public policy, advocacy around public policy is a really effective strategy, and probably one of the only effective strategies to really achieve long-lasting, broad-based change. And I think a huge factor in that is demonstrating to the government that there is broad-based public support for the change that you are seeking. And so really that comes down to community advocacy and members of the community sharing with politicians why a particular issue is important to them. I think that the most important element of that is to humanise an issue for a politician. So if you're going to write to them, for example, if Vision Australia is pushing the government on a certain issue and you want to say to your Member of Parliament why that is important to you, sending them a letter or an email stating the issue and why it's important to you, and also sharing your personal story and your connection is really, I think, the most critical thing. I've worked with a lot of people who have met with their members of parliament. This is when I was at the Stroke Foundation to speak about an issue that the Stroke Foundation was pushing for. And I can tell you that the only thing the politician cared about in those meetings were the person's personal connection to stroke and their personal story. So I really think that's the most important thing in getting cut through. And just another thing to remember as well, if you do write to a minister or even your member for your electorate and you don't have any luck in receiving a response, and have followed up as well. And another thing you can do is contact a senator in your state. So they represent the whole state, and they can make representations to a minister or to your member on your behalf. And I have done that before.
Yeah. So it sounds like you don't necessarily have to be an expert at a particular an issue. The expert role is being able to articulate your specific concerns that you're experiencing. That seems to get cut through.
Exactly. Your expertise is your story and what you know and your lived experience. And I think, as I was mentioning before, trying to sort of draw on the emotion side of it and what it really means to you, and I guess how the issue has impacted your life is what's the most important thing.
And on the other side, we know when it comes to email correspondence that it is quite available now to be able to engage with a member of parliament, to receive masses of generic emails about a particular issue. Describe, I guess, what is that read? Is that acknowledged? If Nick Xenophon or a member of parliament was to get 100 pre-generated emails on a particular issue, is that effective, or what's that experience like?
Yeah, look, it's not the most effective way to go about it. Sort of automatically generated style emails, while we will notice them in some capacity, they're not a good tool to get attention and to sort of generate change. You've really got to personalise it. I think that's the most critical thing to remember, and really detail why it's important to you. Yeah.
We've just got thank you very much, Jess. We've got a question from Robert around which will be providing the guidelines on how to do advocacy. And yep, we will be sending through a link to all of our self-advocacy guides, which also includes a copy of our comprehensive influencing government guide. And in there, it provides really high level and also detailed information on the steps that you would want to consider taking. If you come to that comprehensive guide and you're still after more information, please do reach out to us at campaigns@visionaustralia.org. We're ready to support you. Bruce, In your experience, because you do have a very rich history in this sector, what are some of the effective ways that you've seen politicians and the industry bodies listen to constituents? I know that you were involved around some of the work done with tactile notes, and there was a petition involved in that. Why was that successful?
Yes, but thanks, Rini. The campaign to get a tactile feature on Australian banknotes was actually started by a teenage boy called Connor McLeod. That I think he's become almost a household word now because of that campaign. And he and his family and put a lot of initial work into that campaign, and they got a change.org petition with 57,000 signatories. Now, the thing about that petition is that that's not all they did. They had the petition, but then they also contacted politicians. They also contacted the Reserve Bank. They contacted all sorts of people. Then they contacted us and asked if we would support them. They also lodged a disability discrimination complaint in relation to the lack of tactile features, and we became involved in that campaign. And the thing, there were a number of things I think that came together to make that a successful campaign. Firstly, that we were able to demonstrate that the technology existed to put the feature onto the Australian banknotes because it was used in other countries. We were then able to, through the change.org petition with a large number of signatories, show that this issue did have broad-based community support, as Jess was talking about before, how valuable that is. I've seen other sort of cases and been involved where meeting with politicians and telling individual stories has made a big difference, much more so than sending out pre-generated emails, which we've done in the past and don't do anymore. And I'm thinking of the time a few of us met with Malcolm Turnbull when he was Minister for Communications back in late 2014 to talk about the importance of audio description. And there are a few of us who were blind, who had low vision, and we talked about what audio description on television meant to us as individuals, not as a an organisation or as a representative of a community, but to us as individuals. And he listened to us and he said, "You've made a very compelling case." And it was not too much long after that we had the iView trial of audio description that went for 18 months. And so that I think was a good experience in how talking to politicians on your level as an individual makes a big difference.
And yet what I am hearing tonight is that regardless of whether it's in an individual matter or if it's a systemic issue, it really does come down to the heart of being able to really articulate your personal story, which should give comfort around not having to be an expert. But the challenge sometimes is that individuals might feel intimidated, even the most confident or articulate person. What are some of the ways, I guess, to recognise that the role of a Member of Parliament, Jess?
Yeah, thanks, Rennie. And look, this is definitely something I've come across a lot, and I'm not sure if anyone on this webinar tonight does or has felt like this, but that contacting a Member of Parliament can actually be something that's quite intimidating. And I think it's really important to remember that they are there to work for you. And their job, if we're talking about a member of an electorate, their job is to represent the views of their constituency in the Parliament. The next thing to remember is when you do contact a political office, whether it be about a systemic issue or an individual issue, you will be contacted by someone in their office who works for them. So a staff member whose dedicated job is helping constituents with their issues. And I think Bruce has told me about his experience with this. Bruce, I think you were having an issue with the NDIS and you went to your Member of Parliament and you were back and forward with one of their staff members about your issue until eventually you got a resolution. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I didn't actually need to speak to my local MP. I spoke to his, someone who was working in his office. And I think that the thing that, local members in particular, it's not like trying to contact the Prime Minister or a senior minister. They're much more approachable at that local level, and they have people in their office whose job it is to work with constituents and be that sort of gateway between them and the MP.
Exactly, Bruce, that's right. And it's exactly what you just said in terms of if you can form a good relationship with a politician's staff member, they really are your gateway to the Member of Parliament, and they will advocate to the Member of Parliament on your behalf. And then if further action needs to be taken, the Member of Parliament can then advocate to a more senior member, whether it be a minister or what have you, can do that on your behalf as well. So forming a really great relationship with a staff member in an electorate office is actually quite a powerful tool.
Thank you so much. And it's great to be able to get that insight, given your experience with Nick Xenophon's office, and that these individual stories, experience that Bruce has had, as well as I'm hearing your experience of individuals reaching out, are actually heard, they're considered, and they are responded to. Thank you so much if you're joining our webinar tonight around advocacy influencing government. I can see lots of questions and comments are coming through, and we are doing our very best to get through as many as possible tonight. Thank you also for the individuals, I won't go into detail, but for the individuals who have made some comments around the success that they've had with their push around local council matters and being able to show particular issues that they've raised, and again reinforcing how that actually is a very powerful way to make change. We have a question, I think, from Julie on the topic of generic campaigns. How effective is petitioning? I hear that the personalisation is important, but surely sheer numbers are counted as an indication of community will or mood. And I think that's a really good comment around when you do go about considering an issue that matters to you and it affects other people, around how we go using particular tactics like a petition that's going to show the weight of it. Are petitions still regarded, or aren't they?
Look, I don't have a really vast level of experience on this, so I might cross over to you, Bruce, once I've finished. But definitely, they are listened to. It definitely is something that can influence in terms of helping you to form a personal relationship that you can then utilise to your benefit with your Member of Parliament. That's where I think they aren't something that help. But I know when I was working for Nick Xenophon around the Centrelink robo debt issue that was happening, I think we received 350 phone calls in one day on the same issue, and we basically didn't even turn our computers on that day. And that did make us take note. So, Julie, you're right, sheer numbers do matter, but then that sort of campaigning isn't useful, I guess, on more individual issues.
Yep. And Bruce, do you think in that regard around Julie's question around if we look back at that Conor McLeod example that you were going through and you were involved in a strong level, was it the fact that petition, which garnered I think around 57,000 signatures, but it was also complemented with some very, very strong other tactics around it? I think you mentioned Disability Discrimination Act. Do you think it's the weight of a few of those integrated tactics that help get that across the line?
Look, I think, yes, there's a couple of things, thanks, Randy, that I'd like to say about petitions. One is that, yes, it was the combination of tactics. It wasn't just the 57,000 signatures on that petition. It was the petition plus the research that had been done to demonstrate that, yes, this is achievable, it's technologically possible. The downside of petitions is that they've become so easy to create. So with change.org, it's very easy to create a petition. And the downside is that if you don't get large numbers, it can make it look as if it's not really an issue. And I have been sort of involved with some of these petitions where you don't, it's very hard to get more than a couple of hundred signatures, and that doesn't send a good message if you're trying to campaign around this being a systemic issue and you've got a petition that you can only get a couple of hundred signatures on. It might be of some value if you then combine that petition with other things, but I think petitions are in general not a good idea. I know of instances where change.org petitions have attracted 30,000 signatories and nothing has happened as a result. They've been completely ignored. So I think it's a bit like what Jess was saying before about the template pre-generated sort of emails have lost a lot of their original sort of value, and I think the same is happening with with petitions. So I think we should use them with extreme caution.
And just to add on to that, Bruce, I think in terms of Julie, what you were saying about sheer numbers, surely they count. I think yes that they do, but as Bruce was saying, you can have a petition with 30,000 signatures. It almost has to be sheer numbers in terms of it's affecting almost everyone, and that that's sort of when I agree with Bruce. They can be almost a downfall, I think, sometimes, especially if there's not an engagement strategy around them.
Mm.
We've got some other questions around some systemic issues that the blindness and low vision community have been facing for a very, very long time. Firstly, around audio description, it's what's the current, the status on audio description? Do we know what the sector's doing around that particular systemic issue?
Yeah, thanks, Rennie. I'll have a crack at that one. Look, we have, as a sector, been advocating for audio description on television, for a long time. Certainly, as long as I've been at Vision Australia, which was in beginning in 2008, and before then. And we have had some small wins along the way. We had a trial of audio description on television on the ABC in 2012, and then we had the iView trial that I mentioned earlier, which lasted for 15 months, and both of those trials were extremely well received by consumers, and they really demonstrated that audio description was a great value to people who are blind or have low vision. It has been particularly difficult to deal with the broadcasting industry, who have always been extremely resistant to doing anything that might cost them money. So, for example, setting up the hardware, the infrastructure needed to broadcast audio description, and politicians generally are very reluctant to do anything that will put the broadcasting industry offside, because they rely on the broadcasting industry for their promotion and what have you. However, we have been able to raise awareness among politicians of the value of audio description. I think one of the problems with a long campaign is that things change. So the world, the broadcasting world, the world of television isn't the same now in 2019 as it was when we, really started the campaign back in 2008. It's it's a very different environment. And so we have to constantly in these campaigns sort of refresh them, so to speak, and reassess what are the most effective strategies going forward. And since the since the election, the federal election, we've been doing that. But it is still an issue that's of great concern to us in the advocacy space, and we'll continue to do as much as we can to try and bring audio description to Australian television.
That's right. A lot of these systemic issues, what I'm hearing is that, being able to, keep energized and keep networking with those particular stakeholders and being prepared to possibly say the same message, perhaps in different ways and through different allies over a duration it's quite much needed in advocacy, which goes on quite well to our next section. We've got about 5 minutes left of this webinar, and we will do our best to get through your questions. For now, we'll move on to the area around the importance of stakeholder engagement, and particularly around, I guess, the value of nurturing relationships in this space around advocacy. Jess, particularly we've just talked around, you and Bruce have just talked around some issues that have been systemic and requiring ongoing campaigning. And it's quite a natural byproduct to be frustrated when you're showing a particular issue from a human rights perspective or an economic point of view that change needs to happen, but it's not. But so how, in your experience, how important is it still to maintain relationships with decision makers in government, politicians, as well as industry bodies?
Thanks, Rennie. Yeah, so look, I think obviously both nurturing and building on relationships with decision makers is extremely important. I think the first thing to remember is try and form positive relationships with your members of parliament or whichever decision maker it might be outside of a time where you're maybe specifically asking for something, which is often and especially around election time can be the worst time to sort of be showing your personal opinion on something. So for an example, something that could be is if your member of parliament does happen to do something that you actually respect, it can be a great idea to write to them and let them know. And that can sort of set the tone for your relationship with them in terms of them when you are applying pressure to them to act on something. They are a lot more likely to listen to you if you already have that relationship with them. I think also setting your expectations is really important. Being really consistent in your correspondence to them. So my general rule is if you don't hear back within 4 weeks, write to them again and ask why you haven't heard back, but do be polite about it. I think that's one of the other most critical things when nurturing relationships is be firm but be polite. And like I was talking about before, I think is remembering that it's not the member of parliament opening your correspondence, it's actually a staff member, and if you've got them on your side, they will be critical in pushing an issue further. Yeah, I don't know if you've got anything else to say to that, Bruce.
Thanks, Jess. I think what I would add, and it's possibly more sort of relevant for organisations like Vision Australia. We've certainly found that government departments, building relationships with people, public servants who work in government departments is important too, because they often have a great influence on decision makers, because it's the public servants that the politicians look to for advice, particularly around systemic issues. So if there's an issue and you do make contact with a government department, then try to be polite and respectful and build a relationship with someone in that department as well. But as I say, I think the departmental level of influencing is probably something that works best when you're part of a group.
Exactly, I agree, Bruce.
Now we have 1 minute left, and Bruce, I'm going to see if you've got the master skills to provide a response to a question in about 20 seconds if you can. I highly doubt it, but I'm going to test you because you're very good. Do we have an update around the Albert terminals from the Commonwealth Bank?
Look, the short answer is no. From our, you know, from our, that was only 2 seconds. I know that there were various DDA, disability discrimination complaints that Blind Citizens Australia (BCA) lodged against the bank, and those complaints were settled. So, look, we haven't at Vision Australia had any direct contact with the bank around Albert for quite some time. So I think BCA is probably best placed to provide sort of accurate current information about where it's at.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that response, and as well as to you, Jess, and to Bruce for tonight's webinar. The time has gone really, really fast, and we've covered a lot of foundational steps around how you'd go about advocating for change within the context of influencing government and other bodies. We've talked around the principles of the difference between individual and systemic advocacy, some of the key steps and channels you'd want to look at using, and even steps that you might not consider using, but at the heart of it, what I've been hearing is the use of personalized stories is enough. Using your networks to be able to group together like-minded people, and we have examples of Nick Xenophon being receptive to seven stories. So it doesn't have to be the masses, but keep it tailored and personalized. We even discussed around tactics around the use of videos tonight, and even something short and simple can be really, really useful. This webinar has been recorded, and a copy of it will be sent out to you, and we'll also make it available on our social media channels. And our Stand Up for Your Rights guides, we've got a series of them across education, transport, influencing government, and a range of other areas as well. A link will also be emailed to you following the webinar as well. And if you would like to be engaged with our advocacy campaigns, we've had some fantastic wins around voting in Victoria, as well as securing funding and hybrid vehicles, all of what was achieved through a comprehensive approach, including your support as voters. So please, if you have an interest in our advocacy campaigns, if you care about making change, let us know at campaigns@visionaustralia.org, and we'll add you to our mailing list. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Renee. Thank you again, Bruce and Jess, for a very, very comprehensive guide, and thank you to our listeners. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.